We're going to start soon, but we're going to give a few more minutes to find us. And I know there's at least one person who is very serious about getting here, and he's trying to extricate from trying to extricate from another. So we are going to do something to fill 5 minutes that actually decide. That is, we're going to go around from back to front and say who you are and where you're coming from. So, am I audible? Yeah. Amazing. This must be an amplifying mess, because usually I'm impossible. Okay, so Natalie, who's there?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Natalie. I'm the Associate Director of Programs and Operations at the Center for Neuroscience and Society.
All right.
I'll pass it to you.
Hi, I'm Akira. I'm just a staff member of the department.
Okay. Or just.
I'm studying neuroscience. Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm a graduate student in BSc, and I'm also in the STEM program and studying neuroscience.
Yes. Okay.
I'm Sophie. I'm an undergrad studying psychology, and I'm interested in neuroscience, so thank you.
Should we allow her to just take her desk off for a second? Oh, perfect. Yes.
Check 2.
Okay.
I'm Michael, and I'm also at the Department of Psychology, working on a spatial cognition.
I'm Tony. I'm from the Psych Department and the grad student studying spatial navigation and cognitive neuroscience.
My name is Chen Dang. I'm a postdoc in the Department of Psychology.
Jane Jensen, I'm a professor of statistics and data science.
I'm just an anthropologist at the University.
Everyone, my name is Nicole. I am an undergrad in my name is Kelly. I graduated in 2017, but I'm currently employed alongside faculty with the neuropsychiatry department here at Penn, but I also am related to the Galapagos Education and Research Alliance, which functions out here at Test. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sebastian Marco. I'm the platform of Neuroscience.
Hi, I'm Vera Ludwig. I'm also a postdoc in the Neuroscience. Neuroscience initiative.
Dr. Kennedy, I'm a neurologist.
Hello, my name is Loretta. I was studying human development in GSP and also studying neuroscience with Dr. Farah. Thank you.
I'm Saraj. I'm an undergrad studying chemistry.
Okay, awesome. Well, as long as I got this, I'll use it. Okay, I think, I know Russell is coming, and you guys be sure to scold him when he finally arrives. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for the last of this year's Neuroscience and Society talks. So just for those of you who haven't been following along, the theme of this year is well-being and the brain. As we thought coming out of 2 years of pandemic, well, we were interested in well-being and could we understand it and figure out how to have more of it and so forth. So we had 6 talks, this is number 6, on various sources of well-being, from exercise to mindfulness, and how they relate to the body. Our last topic is nature and the environment and well-being. Those, and we are having Marc Berman, who basically pioneered the study of the effect of the environment, nature, built environment, green space, on the mind and brain. His academic life story is a Bachelor of Science in Engineering in Industrial and Operations Engineering from the University of Michigan, a little different. He then got a PhD jointly in psychology and industrial and operations engineering, also from the University of Michigan. He was a postdoc at the Rotman Research Institute in Toronto, great place. And he's been at the University of Chicago since 2014. He's now an associate professor of psychology there. And without further ado, I give you Marc.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Martha, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm really excited to share some of my research with you today. So I'm going to show you something that I kind of stole from Talia Wheatley at Dartmouth. And what she mentions is that we can study a lot about the brain in isolation, like studying a brain in a jar, right? So we can understand a lot of the structure of the brain. We can't really study the function of the brain just in a jar. But you can learn a lot about the brain studying in isolation, but I'm going to argue that that's not going to be enough. That if we really want to get a full understanding of the functioning of the brain, how the brain is really working, we can't just study it like in my jar. So my jar is like a 3 Tesla superconducting magnet, where you shove somebody in the MRI scanner, they're lying really still like this, looking at some kind of stimulation. We can learn a ton about the brain this way, but I'm going to argue that that's not going to be enough, because we don't live in 3 Tesla superconducting magnets. We live in the real world. We're interacting with other people. We're interacting with our environment. And so one thing that I take really seriously in my research is trying to understand these interactions between our brain and other brains, other individuals out in the environment, and also the physical environment, different aspects of the physical environment. So this is not a new idea. So Kurt Lewin in the 1930s posited that human behavior is a function of the person and the environment. So I don't think any of us are that surprised by that, but in the 1930s when proposed this was actually kind of quite surprising. And I might argue that now we're not really taking Lewin so seriously because we tend to focus so much on the person and not so much on the environment. That we still, as psychologists and neuroscientists, we're still doing these really carefully controlled experiments trying to understand brain processing in these really constrained kind of psychological situations, and not really thinking about how the environment is affecting us and affecting our brain processing, and it's really affecting us in profound ways. So I'm going to try to make a case that we also need to study this. We need to be paying a lot of attention to the physical environment that surrounds us and how that affects us. So the person, other things like individual cognitive affective and neural processing, the environment, I'm going to call like the social and physical environment. I sometimes term this the internal environment, so things that are internal to the organism, and this the external environment. And unfortunately, these things are really, really complicated. I mean, it makes it interesting, but it makes it hard to understand. So, we've got about 86 billion neurons, 110,000 miles of axons, 30,000 genes, maybe an infinite number of thoughts and feelings, right? The external environment is kind of equally complex, almost like I would say an infinite amount of degrees of freedom out there in the external environment. And to make matters worse, these things are all dynamic, so things aren't staying the same. Things in the environment are constantly changing, right? So what are we going to do? So in the field of environmental neuroscience, we're going to use psychological, neuroscientific, and computational tools to try to understand all of this complexity and try to see, can we actually get some kind of quantitative parameters to see how the person and the environment are sort of interacting with each other to produce behavior. Does that make sense? Any kind of questions on that? So here's another way that we kind of outline this in a recent article. So here's a map of Chicago where I've quantified all the tree canopy in Chicago, the different neighborhoods. So darker areas in green have more tree canopy. Here's two different neighborhoods in Chicago. This is Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is, very green. Lots of trees in Hyde Park. Here's the Deer North neighborhood with baby deer. Not as many trees up there. We're not going to stop at just looking at the external physical environment. We also need to consider internal environments and how things in internal environments are affecting behavior. We, in North America, spend about 90% of our time indoors. So it's really important to think about internal environments as well, indoor environments as well. Social things, going down here to functional connectivity, maybe epigenetic expression, gene expression. So going from left to right here, I call this the mechanistic approach. So trying to understand how these external physical and social environment factors are sort of getting under the skin and affecting brain and other biological factors. But another way that we can think about things is going from right to left. And I think we don't really think this way very often. And I call this the generative approach. So you could take somebody's biology and say, okay, what kind of environment can we design for them that might optimize their well-being, their psychological well-being, their working memory capacity. So we're not making much progress yet in that direction. I don't know. And I don't.
Say anybody who has me as their IT help is in trouble.
Okay, here, oh, there it is. Okay, yeah. I know, and then okay. So we're not making. This is something I want you to think about is, okay, how can we go from individual biology and think about what kind of physical environment we might want to design to sort of optimize their individual psychological processing. But more people are going this way, trying to like decompose external environment onto individuals, understand the biology of that. But I think it's also equally important to think about, okay, given somebody's biology, how might we design an environment that would optimize their psychological well-being? So in the first part of the talk, I'll talk a lot about green spaces and how green spaces are good for psychological functioning and why we think they're good for psychological functioning. In part two, I'm going to talk about social networks and actually how cities impact social networks, because I don't want to poo-poo cities too much and say, oh, nature is the best environment. There's also a lot of good aspects about cities, and we might want to think about how we can make cities better by incorporating natural elements. And then because this is a neuroscience seminar, I thought I have to show some brains. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we quantify what a brain looks like when it's working hard, when it's exerting a lot of cognitive effort, and maybe we can use that as a proxy to try to understand why interacting with nature is beneficial. Like maybe when we interact with nature, it sort of pushes the brain into sort of more rested, less effortful states versus a lot of the urban environments that we tend to interact with. So that's the three parts here. So the first part, I'm going to talk about the positive effects of natural environments, different psychological, positive psychological impact that we can get from interacting with natural environments. So I thought this was pretty funny. This was something that one of my students found, that why pay money for horror movies, just go down the street with no trees. So I think we all kind of have this intuition that we like nature, nature is pleasant. When we don't have nature around us, you know, we don't feel so good, or the aesthetic of that environment is not going to be as good if there aren't natural elements there. But why is interacting with nature beneficial? So there are a number of different theories that posit why interacting with nature is beneficial. So one theory that I'm going to focus on today is called attention restoration theory, and this theory posits that interacting with nature is beneficial because it can improve attention, which then improves psychological functioning. Other theories, like the biophilia hypothesis, hypothesize that interacting with nature is beneficial because we sort of, as humans, have this innate love of nature, and in these modern times, we're sort of more separated from nature, and so we're not sort of embracing this innate love of nature that we have, and that causes distress. But then if we go into nature, we sort of resolve that distress and get these kind of benefits. I have a little bit of an issue with this hypothesis because I kind of say, well, if we have such a strong innate love of nature, why do we make the choices that we do as a society in terms of not preserving nature? I know it's complicated, but that always kind of bugged me about the biophilia hypothesis. And other people posit that interacting with nature is beneficial because it reduces stress. And it's possible that all of these different theories are correct, but I'm going to focus on this attention restoration theory. And one of the key elements of attention restoration theory is that humans have two major forms of attention. So one kind of attention is called voluntary or directed attention, or sometimes it's referred to as top-down or directed attention. And that's the kind of attention where you, as an individual person, decide what you're going to pay attention to. So presumably, you're deciding to pay attention to me, even though you could easily find something more interesting on your phone or your laptop as I'm talking. But presumably, you're going to decide to focus your attention on me. And problematically, this directed attention resource or top-down attention we feel is fatigable or depletable. That you can only sort of direct your attention for so long before you become mentally fatigued and you can't focus anymore. And I see that all the time when I'm lecturing. Like the first 5 minutes of class, students are very engaged, I've got eyes on me, paying attention really well. 45 minutes into lecture, I see a lot of this kind of stuff. People nodding back, they're starting to fall asleep. I don't think I'm a bad lecturer, I just think humans have limited attentional capacity. You can only focus your attention for so long before you become mentally fatigued and you can't focus anymore. So that's one kind of attention that we think about. The other kind of attention that we think about is called involuntary attention, or sometimes it's called bottom-up or exogenous attention. And that's the kind of attention that's automatically captured by things in the environment. So loud noises, bright lights, those things automatically capture our attention, and it's thought that that is less susceptible to fatigue or depletion. So you don't often hear people say, oh, I can't watch that movie anymore, it's too interesting, I'm just too tired watching it. Or I can't look at that beautiful waterfall anymore, it's just too interesting, I'm too tired, I can't look at it anymore. So the idea behind attention restoration theory is that if you can find environments that have rich, interesting stimulation in them that sort of activate this involuntary attention while simultaneously not taxing your directed attention, you can sort of restore or replenish this precious directed attention resource. And we think that nature is one example of such an environment, that often a lot of nature that's around us, like your local park, there's not billboard advertising, there's not car traffic, you can kind of just go into that environment, let your attention be automatically captured by the stimulation in that environment, and not have to use directed attention. And then after your interaction with that environment, you can come out and you'll be sort of replenished in this directed attention resource. And we think that a lot of natural environments meet these criteria of having interesting stimulation to activate this involuntary attention while simultaneously not putting demands on directed attention. But that doesn't mean that nature is the only environment that can do this. There could be other environments that can do that too. You know, maybe walking through a museum could do this or something like that. Or walking down a street that doesn't have a lot of car traffic but has really interesting architecture. So this theory doesn't say that nature is the only environment that can do this. It just says that nature is a good example of an environment that can do this. Now, sometimes I get reviewers say to me, well, what about a wildfire? Or what if you're in the woods and you're being chased by a bear? And I would say, that's not going to be restorative, right? You have to use a lot of directed attention. So the kind of nature that I'm talking about is kind of like the local nature in your neighborhood. It's safe, you feel safe there, has interesting stimulation to capture your involuntary attention. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with people?
Yeah, I mean, even those safe environments, are those thought of as having not being taxing on directed attention?
I would
there's
say
bugs, there's still noise,
right, yes.
bugs, you know.
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So I think if there are things in the environment that are making you uncomfortable, that are going to start taxing directed attention, we don't think that environment will give you that replenishment of those resources.
The negative stimulus is not always directed. It would also be involuntary, right? If the bugs are annoying.
Right, but I think you're going to use directed to like get away from it. You know, it might automatically capture your attention and get away from it. That brings up the second point that I think is important to talk about, which is the idea of soft fascination. So we think that different stimuli in the environment can capture your attention involuntarily in different ways. So the waterfall that I see, it's interesting, it captures my attention, but it doesn't sort of capture all of my attentional resources. I can still kind of mind wander and think about other things while I look at the waterfall. But if I'm watching a really intense movie, or if I'm walking in Times Square, that's also super interesting. But it kind of captures all of my attentional resources in a harsh way and doesn't really let go. So we think that the kind of stimulation that will sort of replenish your directed attention needs to be sort of softly fascinating and not just kind of harsh attentional capture. And we think a lot of natural environments tend to have this softly fascinating stimulation. But again, nature doesn't have to be the only environment that has that. We just think it's an example of an environment that can have that pretty readily. So is that making sense? I know this feels a little bit squishy, but we're trying to sort of operationalize this a little bit more. So how did we test this? Well, one way that we tested this, so this is a study that I did at the University of Michigan. So here's the psychology building, East Hall at the University of Michigan. So we brought participants into the lab. We gave them a challenging working memory and attention task, a backwards digit span task. This is a task where you hear digits out loud, like 5, 6, 7, and you need to repeat them back in backwards order, so 7, 6, 5. 3 digits is really easy, but we increase the number of digits all the way up to 9 digits. Okay? At about 5 digits, the task gets really hard. So you come into the lab, we give you this backwards digit span task, we also assess your mood. Then we give you a map, and we say, okay, we want you to walk through the Ann Arbor Arboretum, this is our nature walk, or you're going to walk through downtown Ann Arbor on Huron Street and come back into the lab. We also did two other things. We put a GPS watch on our participants, so they didn't just go to Starbucks. We knew they actually went on a walk, or we knew if they got lost or not. If they got lost, we thought, well, that might not be restorative if you're lost in the nature park. We also did one more thing. We took participants' cell phones. So why did we take participants' cell phones? Because we didn't want people texting or chit-chatting while they're on the walk. We wanted them to actually be engaged with the environment. Okay? They're alone. They're alone. So they've got the map, they've got the GPS watch, no cell phone. They go on the walk. Each walk was about 2.6 miles, and it took participants about 50 minutes to complete the walk. Then you come back to the lab, we assess your memory and attention again, we assess your mood. Then you come back to the lab a week later, and you repeat the whole procedure. But if you walked in nature the first week, you walked in the urban environment the second week, or vice versa. So everybody was their own control. And we had about 40 participants. And here are the results that we find in the backwards digispan test. We find that participants improve by about 20% after walking in nature compared to walking in the urban environment. So people improve by about 1.5 digits on this backwards digispan test after walking in nature compared to the urban environment. You might be thinking, well, participants probably enjoy the nature walk more. And maybe because they enjoyed the nature walk more, that's why they showed these cognitive benefits. We did find that, yes, participants did enjoy the nature walk more, but we didn't find a correlation between improvements in mood and improvements in cognitive performance on this backwards digispan test. So that was pretty suggestive that it wasn't just we were putting participants in good moods, something else was happening on this nature walk. We also had participants walk at different times of the year. So some participants walked in June. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius. Participants came back and said, Mark, I can't believe you paid me to go for a walk outside. It was awesome. I've never been to the Arb before. Showed really healthy mood benefits, really healthy attention benefits. We also had people walk in January, 20 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 15 Celsius. Participants said I was freezing my butt off out there. I hated it out there. Showed the same cognitive improvement as the people that walked in June. So you didn't even have to like the nature walk to get this cognitive benefit. You did have to like the walk to get the mood benefit, but you didn't have to like the walk to get the cognitive benefit.
Was the same, so the same group of people doing it in winter versus summer? Or
No, this was a between subject variable. The season was between subject variable.
Right. So the type of people who would even do this walk in winter are probably pretty different than the type of people who do this walk in summer.
They were all recruited the same, so I doubt that there was a between subject bias here, that a different group of people was doing it. These are just University of Michigan undergrads. We send these advertisements out to participate in research. I'm not worried here about a bias in terms of sample. Yeah.
Was there a certain speed that you directed people to use? Like maybe some were like go super fast, like exercising, and others were just struggling?
They all more or less walked it. It took participants about 50 to 55 minutes to do the walk. So what's your idea there? You think they were walking faster in one environment versus the other environment?
I was just curious how, like, if you do a very sporty walk or something super fast, if you would also get the same benefits, or if you miss out on all the potential benefits. You have other
yes.
benefits, obviously, but
I agree with you. I think if people were walking super fast through the environment, they wouldn't get as much of the benefit as if they were having a kind of a leisurely walk. And I think for the most part, these participants were having a leisurely walk.
Though that element definitely would have been different in Michigan in the winter versus.
But they have to do the urban walk in the winter too. So that was within subject.
Yeah. It just sounds like a very different experimental environment in the winter versus the summer.
Right. Which I think worked out for us in a nice way, that it wasn't all about mood, that there was something else going on. So that was kind of a nice quasi-experimental thing that just kind of happened.
Just to what Shane, maybe, I'm not sure, but did you have like actual decline in the end to do the experiment in the winter? Like,
Yeah, I guess, did you advertise that they'd have to be taking an hour walk outside as part of the solicitation for.
No, that wasn't part of the solicitation. It was just, it was
Come
advertised.
in, we'll do something with
We're
it.
gonna write.
Chicago students are very dutiful.
This was a Michigan study, yeah. We can talk about the Chicago one differently. Chicago, we have different problems. Chicago has different problems that we can talk about. Yeah.
So I understand the psychological task you did was a working memory task, right? And back task, or not an back, but at least
A vast digit fantastic.
But since the theory is about attention, did you think about also maybe adding an attention task, like a flanker
Yeah,
task?
so
or
we
something about-
did do the attention network task, so that's like a flanker task. I don't know if I put the slide here, no I didn't. But, and also to get at some of these questions too about weather and things like that, we actually repeated this task with pictures. So there's pictures of urban scenes, pictures of nature scenes. We don't get as strong an effect, but we do get similar effects even with these simulated nature, suggesting that there's something about the visual features of nature that can produce these benefits. I'm one of the people that believes it's very hard to separate attention from working memory. I think working memory has an enormous attentional component. Maybe you can do pure attention tests that don't have a working memory component, I believe that. I don't think you can separate attention from working memory if you're doing something working memory. But we did do a task with the attention network task. We only found improvements on the executive attention portions of that task. So the one where the center flanker is different from the flanking stimuli. We didn't find any benefits for like cueing, attentional cueing or alerting. But I think those effects are kind of weak. So actually in the meta-analyses, it seems like actually you get more benefit on working memory tasks than on pure attention tasks. Now, I don't know if that's just because working memory tasks tend to be more challenging, or if there's something about having this working memory component as an add-on that's leading to fun. We also did the study with participants who had been diagnosed with clinical depression. And here the tweak that we did to this, so we recruited participants who had been diagnosed with clinical depression with a structured clinical diagnostic interview. Before they went on the walk, we also had them think about a negative memory. So we're trying to induce rumination, and we thought, we weren't sure, okay, maybe if you're an individual who's been recently diagnosed with depression, we have you thinking about a negative memory, maybe going for a walk alone or going an urban walk alone is going to heighten rumination, which would then have really deleterious effects on working memory. And we found actually just the opposite. So in this population of participants with clinical depression, the improvement in backwards digit span, the effect size is about the same, but the variance was much tighter. So we actually got stronger effects in this clinical population. And in fact, there are even some indications that maybe they got a little bit worse. Their working memory performance got a little bit worse after the urban walk. So this is just to plant a little seed too to think about, okay, maybe this is something that could be interesting in sort of a clinical kind of setting, a supplement to different kinds of existing therapies for depression. So I said we performed a similar procedure with pictures of nature versus urban pictures. The results are similar, but they're not as strong. To get to your question back here, we saw only improvements in this executive portion of the attention network task, suggesting it's specific to directing attention, though I think these are kind of weak effects. I'm not going to put a lot of faith in those effects. I'm not sure how replicable those are going to be. So we're going to try to do that again, see if they work again. We've also done it with sounds, so now you're listening to nature sounds versus urban sounds. Here, participants did backwards digit span, and they also did a dual NBAC test, so another difficult working memory test. Participants showed improvement after the nature sounds, not so much after the urban sounds. We also tried nature versus urban videos, using the backwards digit span task and also Raven's progressive nature series. So these are different scores. So after watching a nature video, participants improved on backwards digit span and Raven's. After the urban video, there was some improvement in Ravens, but really nothing much in backwards digit span. No video was sort of this like control condition to try to see is urban fatiguing people, or is nature leading to improvements, or are both things kind of happening? Maybe both things are kind of happening. It's a little bit unclear. Yeah.
I'm interested to see what kind of videos were shown. Were they like documentaries? Were they like David Attenborough?
More like David Attenborough.
Mm.
Yeah. More like David Attenborough. Here's a meta-analysis that we did. So we looked at about 12 studies where people did simulations of nature. So these were like pictures or videos. And we find pretty consistent improvements in the backward lifespan test after interacting with nature. In the first session of the experiment, so these are all within subject designs. You get improvement after the urban environments too. Just I think with practice, you get better at the test. We really start to see separation between the two environments in the second session. So if your second session was nature, you still continue to improve. If the second session is urban, you don't show that improvement anymore. So this is just, this is kind of cool that it's not just some kind of practice effect that's happening. You're actually improving above and beyond practice. Or maybe this is sort of like helping with learning, that maybe this nature environment might help with learning. We also had mood in this meta-analysis, and again, we didn't find any significant relationship between changes in mood and changes in cognitive performance. Again, some are suggesting that it's not just that we're making people happier, that they're getting these cognitive improvements, something deeper is going on. So just to summarize, brief interactions with nature led to a 20% improvement in working memory span. The effects appear not driven by mood or time of the year. Similar effects with pictures. Similar effects with sound and visual depictions, although they're not quite as strong as the real thing. And the effects appear more pronounced for individuals who have been diagnosed with major depression. So they may be in a more cognitively fatigued state, maybe they have more room to improve. It is one possibility for why this is working so well. So any questions on this? Or I'm going to switch, yeah.
When you talk about mood, there is a group difference about mood, right? So
Yes.
people who go in nature usually have a better mood.
Except not in the winter time.
Except not in the winter. And they also tend to have better working memory.
Yes,
So
but if you
say-
correlate those together, you don't see a reliable correlation.
So there's a group difference, but within the group of participants, when you correlate these two things, they don't correlate to that
Right.
point. Because of course, if you would take the entire sample, you would see a correlation that would just recapitulate the main effect that you're seeing as a group.
Well, no, I think what you think about, there's two independent effects that are kind of happening,
Okay.
but it's not the case that the people that improve in mood the most are also the ones that improve in cognitive performance the most.
Right. Within the group, okay.
Two dependent effects.
Two dependent effects, yes. Sorry. That's right. But those dependent effects are independent, is what I was trying to say. It appears to be independent. The mood is changing, cognitive performance is changing. It doesn't seem like one is causing the other. They're both kind of happening independently. Any other questions on this? Yeah.
I guess I have questions about the modality. So with sound and visual depictions, it's similar but less. What if, we were with a VR, kind of visual edition, or just bike riding versus walking versus skydiving? Would that change how people perceive?
I think that goes back to your question that biking, I would say, would have less of an effect because it's just going by too fast. With VR, I think anything that you're doing to make the interaction more similar to the real thing, you'll get bigger effects.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of why the real nature is stronger effects than the, just the visual, just the acoustic, because you're getting a multimodal experience. You're getting the olfaction, the tactile, the visual, the auditory, it's all there. If the VR thing is replicating more of that and it's realistic, I think it will be pretty similar. But I'm not arguing that we should destroy all the nature and just have VR. I'm not sure we're ever get VR good enough to really get it done.
With the sound one, when you're controlling, because that's artificial, right? That's not natural sounds. When you say similar effects of sound, the picture, you're
Sound
giving them
depiction.
kind of some.
We had recordings of like nature
And those
sounds.
are the same volume and both.
Yes. But there are certainly lots of acoustic features that are different, like entropy and spectral centroids and stuff like that. Those differ between those sounds. Just like they do the visual. The fractalness in nature, stimuli can differ. I'm not going to talk about that too much more here, but we can. I'm happy. I have other slides that we can go deep into that area. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears now and talk about different behaviors in different environments. So here's the Robert Taylor Homes, which is a public housing project in Chicago that's now been demolished. And everybody here is going to know that these were not the most desirable places to live. And there were lots of problems in these public housing facilities. Ming Kuo and Bill Sullivan and Andrea Faber-Taylor did some really cool quasi-experimental studies with these public housing facilities. What they did is they looked at the different apartment views out of these public housing facilities and saw what did people see out of their window. And for some people, they categorize this class as like a poor nature view, that you just have a view of like asphalt or a sidewalk, versus like a good nature view, like you have a view of a tree or some shrubbery or some grass. And what they did is they measured, with that same backwards Digispan test, they measured people's performance who lived in these different apartments in these public housing projects. And what they found is that the people who had the modest views of nature, they scored better on these backwards Digispan tests compared to the people that didn't have the good nature view. And if they looked at the kids who lived in these different apartments, they found sort of better impulse inhibition as measured with the Stroop test and better delay of gratification in the apartments that families had the modest view of nature versus the poor view of nature. Now what's cool about these studies is that families are sort of randomly distributed into these different apartments. So it's not the case that more educated or wealthier families or healthier families get the view of nature and the other families don't. These families are just randomly assigned to these different apartments. It's also not the case that the families that have the nature view are sort of staring out the window all day long and the other families aren't. These are kind of relatively implicit effects. You wouldn't really notice much different in like the behavior of how people are looking out the window for these different apartments, and yet it's having a significant impact on their cognitive performance. They also looked at the amount of reported crimes in these public housing facilities, and they found that if there was more vegetation around some of these public housing facilities, there was less reported crime in those facilities. And you might be wondering, okay, what does crime or aggression have to do with attention? So keep that in your brain. So again, they found less reported crimes, less reported overall aggression when there was more nature, more modest nature around the public housing facility. And they found greater attention, so higher scores on these cognitive tests in the public housing facilities that had more green space. And so if they run a mediation model, they actually find that attention improvements were mediating the aggression improvements. So the path that what they think is happening is that green space can improve attentional performance, which then can reduce aggression. So what does attention have to do with aggression or impulsivity? And I'll give you an anecdote, what I think it has to do with. So if you imagine that you don't get a lot of sleep and you can't concentrate, I'm going to suspect that you're going to be much more irritable and you're going to be much more likely to behave impulsively in those situations. So we think that there are sort of shared resources between cognitive functions and self-control. So we think that if you have like a higher capacity to direct attention, that you're also going to have a better ability to sort of control your impulses and to have higher self-control. That's what we theorize. So we think there's actually shared resources between these cognitive functions and self-control, and one of the shared resources that we think is between self-control and these cognitive functions is this ability to direct attention. So that's what we're theorizing. We're theorizing that's a critical element. So maybe I'll pause here for a minute to see if there's any questions on that.
That's super interesting, especially if they've been randomly allocated to different places, like a perfect clinical trial kind of. I'm wondering, is there also something else like natural lighting? Have you thought about quantifying natural lighting across these different apartments? I imagine that some people facing south, for example, they have more than people facing north.
I think that's a really interesting question. So we haven't studied natural light. I think that certainly plays a role in lots of things. I don't know if that would explain those findings. Maybe natural light did also differ there too. I don't know. The one anecdote that I can tell you about, so I gave a talk at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. They're a big architecture firm in Chicago. And they're really interested in this phenomenon where people that live on the 8th floor and below in tall buildings die sooner than people that live the 8th floor and above, controlling for age, education, and income. And they're trying to understand why that is. One thing that they think about is light. Another thing that they think about is pollution. They don't know, but it's this fascinating finding that they have that people that live the 8th floor and below in these tall buildings have earlier mortality than people who live the 8th floor and above, controlling for all the demographic factors you can think of.
And controlling for health.
And controlling for health, of course.
Because I mean, one of the main reasons somebody might live lower in a building is they're actually inherently unhealthy. Like even conditioning
Sure.
age, they're unhealthier.
Sure.
Well, not if there's elevators in the building.
Well, no, that's even with the elevators, people definitely tend to select within buildings based on health.
People have speculated about the prospect.
Say that again, sir.
People have speculated about a prospect for a higher, getting higher, but you just have better.
Right.
That prospect refuge.
Right, so that's that other theory, prospect refuge theory, that humans prefer environments that have high prospect and high refuge. So if you're higher up in the building, you have higher prospect, you can see what's going out, and that might also engender some kind of health. Yeah.
My question isn't about the living on the 8th floor above or below, but I was wondering, because I know like the urban heat effect is something that might affect these things. Like when your neighborhood has less green space and more concrete, it's blacker, you know, it causes more heat to be absorbed in the area, and those darker colors of the ground emit more heat out and warm your environment. So it's a phenomenon that's been observed that when in hotter environments there is more crime and things that you've just cited in your past slides. So I was wondering if you've looked at that effect in tandem.
Yeah, so I love that question. That's a great question. So to address that question, we actually bought a sauna. We've got a sauna in the first floor of the University of Chicago psychology building, and we're going to heat people up and see if they're more aggressive. The thing that's tricky so there's two competing hypotheses about that. One is this temperature aggression hypothesis that I'm just positing. The other is called routine activities theory. And basically, that in warm days, there's just more people outside, which gives people more opportunity for crime. And some of the evidence to support that is that warm days in the winter that are not warm enough to really give you heat stress, like 50 degrees Fahrenheit in January, see huge spikes in crime. And so they think that's because there's just more people outside, and that just gives people more opportunity to commit crime. But we're trying to these are hard things to tease apart, right? I'm watching Shay because he knows as a statistician, these are hard things to tease apart. We're going to try to do it. It's going to be difficult. I think it's worth it because I think we got to get out of the lab. We can't just stay in the lab. We have to try to get out into the real world a little bit. But it's going to be messy. Yeah.
How does the view of nature change as a function of the height and where you live in the building? Because you've been talking about this effect above 8th floor, but if I live on the 15th floor of a building, I might not see a lot of trees.
You know what's funny about that? I think we should think more about how the urban looks from that thing. And my hunch is that the urban, from those views, actually starts to look a little bit more natural. That you actually might see a little bit more of these natural patterns in the existing architecture from those heights as well. But that's just a hypothesis. I don't know if that's really true.
And close.
Say that again?
Sky, clouds.
Right, yes. I mean, urban canyons, when you're down like that, it's not super pleasant.
Yeah, I just, with that study where they were trying to define kind of a binary, nature versus urban view for those apartments, like things in the, anything above like the first floor, I assume it's some mixture, like I don't know how they actually discretize that.
Right.
Because you're seeing both, like, if you're on the 20th floor, you're obviously seeing both trees and urban, probably every single one of those views, right?
So in these studies, I don't want to conflate things. Here, I don't really know anything about what floor people were on. They were just saying what's just out your window. I don't know if they have.
Yeah, I just, I guess for anything above the first floor, how they decided that was a nature view versus an urban view,
Yeah. I think they actually took photographs and they just had people rate with how natural the view was. Yeah.
I have a question for you, procedural question.
Okay.
You are getting so many more questions during your talk than our speakers usually get.
Okay.
And that is fine.
Yeah.
It will not result in you kind of having to abandon the last half of your talk.
Right. I think we're doing okay. I think what I'll do is maybe I'll give some teasers and then kind of pull the audience and say, okay, you want to spend more time on this? You want to, choose your own adventure kind of.
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't believe it to get in, but it seems like, people select their apartments, right? So it seems like a lot of the explanations here are the effectively.
Right, not here they don't select their apartments, but.
Here they don't,
Right,
but most buildings do.
Yes.
So it seems like there could be something in the people who select a hierarchy.
Right, that's what Shane is.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's what Shane is.
Yeah, I don't know how they control for well in that study, right?
And let's not give them more credit. This is anecdotal that Skidmore owns the rail told me, so I don't even know what the data is.
It's not,
Right.
okay, so it's
Right.
not.
Well, but I think it's interesting to think about. It's something they've observed, whether there's some kind of confounding variable there that, I don't know. I can't tell you. Okay, so we also looked at this with kind of an interesting data set. So here's Kate Scher, she's a PhD student in my lab. She's actually a Penn alum. And we had a really cool data set here. So we had cell phone tracking data. So these are kind of really cool and creepy data. So basically we had beacons from 100,000 Chicagoans. So we get their latitude, longitude, locations for the whole month of May in 2017. So from those data, we can see the lat long, go to some location at night, stay there overnight, that's where the person lives, and then see where that beacon goes throughout the whole month of May in 2017. And from those cell phone traces, we quantified two interesting variables. So one was, how often did you leave your neighborhood and go and visit a park? So we said we required to leave your neighborhood because we wanted to try to get away from just wealthier neighborhoods having more parks. So you had to leave your neighborhood to go to a park. How often does that happen? And how is that related to the amount of crime in your census tract? So the amount of park visits that people have in their neighborhood, how is that related to crime in that neighborhood? The other variable that we quantified was something that we called street activity. So this was like, how often are people sort of out and about in your nearby census tract? Like how many people are sort of out together? This would be like Jane Jacobs' thoughts of like eyes on the street, which she thought would be related to a good neighborhood. People are out and about, they're not even talking to each other, but people are out, with eyes on the street, people are going to be comfortable going outside. So how much street activity is there in your neighborhood? How is that related to crime? How many park visits are there in the neighborhood, and how is that related to crime? And we're going to control for all kinds of demographics, age, education, ethnicity, race, all these kinds of variables to see, do these factors have a statistically independent effect on crime? So here's some maps. So we also looked at tree canopies. So this is that map that I showed you before. This is with satellite, actually this is LiDAR, I think. We can quantify the amount of tree canopy in all these different neighborhoods in Chicago. So darker greens here have higher tree canopy. And we related that to violent and non-violent crime. This is just violent crime, I believe. Controlling for age, education, ethnicity, income, all those kinds of things. And we found basically in the regression that if you increase tree canopy by 5% in the census tract, that would be related to a 3% reduction in crime. And to get that equivalent 3% reduction in crime, sort of in an income way, you would need to pull 9% of the population out of poverty. Okay, so that's pretty impressive, I think. Here's this like street activity variable. So neighborhoods in higher magenta, they have more sort of people out on the street at the same time, potentially interacting with each other. You can see a lot of it here sort of in the core of Chicago, where there's a lot more of businesses and things like that, which makes sense. We found that if you increased street activity by 5%, that would be related to a 7% reduction in crime. To get that equivalent decrease in crime sort of monetarily, you'd have to pull 21% of the population out of poverty. And if we look at park visits, so if you increase the average park visit by 1 park visit per month in the census tracts, that would be related to a 14% reduction in crime. And you can see too here on the map that many of these areas that have the higher park visits are the ones by the lake, presumably because you also, even if there's not a park in your neighborhood, there's a park nearby, so there's a little bit of a bias there. But to get that equivalent decrease in violent crime, you'd have to take 41% of the population out of poverty. So again, I don't want to make strong causal claims here, but this is an interesting association. And it's sort of consistent with what we're kind of thinking about, that if people are going out into nature to maybe get some kind of refuge that's going to increase their directed attention, which will then sort of increase self-control, then maybe that would produce reductions in crime. Now there's the bad case scenario is just more peaceful, less aggressive people choose to go to parks more often, but they can't be more educated, they can't be wealthier, blah, 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 blah. Because we're controlling for all of that here. And this is just to say we did the same thing in New York. So now we have 300,000 people that we're tracking in New York. I'm just showing you the map where we replicate the findings in New York. So we get the same results in New York as we did in Chicago. And now we're trying to extend this to the entire country. So now we have data from SafeGraph, which gives us 2% of the US population. And it's a time series, so we're not just restricted to 1 month. We have like 2 years of data, so we can start to see, okay, if there's fluctuations in park visits, do we see these kind of fluctuations in violent crime, controlling for all of those demographic factors. So, any questions about this?
I'm intrigued how you actually control for the wealth. Because the type of people who live along the lake in Chicago are much wealthier population. How do you control for wealth when the correlation is so strong between park space at the neighborhood level and wealth in that neighborhood? And obviously, wealth is so highly correlated with crime.
Right. So
so
they're not perfectly correlated. They're not perfectly correlated.
But you're not going to have enough poor people that are living right near the lake in Chicago to kind of do any kind of match pair type. I don't know exactly.
So we're going to dinner tonight, right?
Yeah.
So we'll talk about dinner. The one thing that I'll say too that's a little bit surprising, like in Chicago, the correlation between tree canopy and income, there isn't really much of a correlation. So actually in Chicago, a lot of wealthy people live in the loop that doesn't have a lot of trees. So that one, this one too, it's not. This one has more of a correlation between income and park visits, but it's still not as high as you would think. I can't remember exactly what it was. Maybe it was like 0.5, 0.6.
I was just curious, where do you get these data and what do you know about the individuals? So like when you talk about controlling for wealth, are you controlling for the wealth of the individual or just the...
No, the census tract.
Yeah. My first question, where do you get these data?
So these ones, no, these are hard to get. Here we had a postdoc that had a relationship with this place called Carto Lab that had these data. The SafeGraph data, we have any academic can get the SafeGraph data.
Okay.
So the SafeGraph data is a much larger data set. It's, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. There's a little bit of, they make it more anonymous than the Carto Lab data that we have in Chicago, New York. But it's a really get that anybody can get it. So we can talk more about that. Okay, so I think I presented sort of a relatively modest intervention that seemed to have a positive effect on diverse problems. So going for short walks in nature led to improvements in working memory and attention. Living near nature or using nature, going to parks, seemed to be associated with less crime. But I don't want you to leave with the impression that I'm saying, okay, if we just have a lot of parks and plant trees and sing Kumbaya, we're gonna like solve all these problems. I mean, these are super, super complicated problems. As Shane's pointing out, it's even complicated to do the statistical modeling of these things, right? These are very, very complicated problems. But I really want to hammer home that the physical environment and how we interact with the physical environment has a profound impact on our behavior. And I think as humans, we really, really ignore this because we have so much control over the environment. And we have so much control over the environment, I think we almost feel like we're immune to the environment. But we're not immune to the environment. The environment has a significant impact on behavior, and so you can't judge behavior in a vacuum. You have to consider the whole context. You have to consider where people are living, what's the noise level, how much disorder is there, how much green space is there. The other thing I want to mention too is that I think a lot of people think that green spaces are an amenity and not a necessity. And I think what we're sort of saying is like, no, they're kind of a necessity. It's not just nice to have. We need it. Just like we need clean water, clean air, we need green spaces. And we can talk more too about some of the other mechanisms, like green spaces get rid of PM 2.5, so they get rid of pollutants in the air. And that also can have cognitive impacts on people. So it's not just about the aesthetic too. The trees are doing things to the environment. The microbiome of nature might also. Okay, now I'm really going to switch gears. I'm going to do a harsh, because I don't want, because sometimes people say, oh, the cities are bad now. We just want to go out into nature. I say, no, that's not what we want to do. We want to preserve the nature that's there. And there's a lot of really, really good and sometimes counterintuitive things about cities that make them really, really beneficial. So I'm going to talk about some research that we're doing looking at city size and depression. So I think a lot of people think that as cities get larger, more populated, more stressful, and that's going to lead to poor mental health. And what I'm going to argue here is actually that might not be the case. That actually, as cities get larger, they could be related to actually better mental health in some aspects. So this is work for my student Andrew Steer. So again, I wanted to talk to you about this because I wanted to talk a little bit about some benefits of urban environments too. So what this work is going to show is that how infrastructure networks of cities change as cities get larger. That's actually going to impact how we interact with each other and the richness of our social networks. And we think that is actually going to impact our psychology and maybe even depression likelihood. Okay, that as cities get larger, the infrastructure is changing, there's more people utilizing the streets and the sidewalks, more people bumping into each other. That actually might change or enlarge our social networks, which then might change our depression likelihood. There's been a number of people that have talked about how our risks of depression are inversely proportional to social connectivity. That if we have sort of richer social networks, that may buffer us against depression. And if you do sort of a social network kind of analysis, they find, this is this Rosenquist-Fowler and Christakis paper, they find that depression tends to cluster around the periphery of social networks. So people who are sort of more central in the social networks are less likely to develop depression. People sort of on the more periphery of social networks are more likely to develop depression. And then my colleague at University of Chicago, Luis Betancourt, has done a lot of really interesting work looking at how things scale as cities get larger. So for example, I'll start here. So here's log gross domestic product in US dollars by log population of cities. And what he finds is that you get this super linear increase in GDP as cities get larger. So New York City is about twice the population of Chicago. New York City doesn't have 100% the GDP of Chicago. It's got 116% the GDP of Chicago. So it gets this, it's got this extra 16%. So something is boosting up per capita GDP in these larger cities. And the same thing, Chicago is about twice the size of Indianapolis. Chicago doesn't have 100% more of the GDP of Indianapolis. It's got 116% more GDP than Indianapolis. Here is an example of economies of scale. So here is log population versus log road miles. So how much road does a city need as it gets bigger? And it turns out, as cities get larger, you need less amount of road per capita to traverse the city. Now, that also leads to more congestion in cities, but you can kind of get away with it. So New York City doesn't have 100% the road miles of Chicago. It's only got 84% more road miles than Chicago. Is that making sense? Okay, so what does this have to do with psychology? Well, maybe this is kind of hinting at psychology a little bit. The other thing I want to say too is this 0.16 and this being 0.16 less than 1 is not a coincidence. There's sort of something special about this 1/6. And the special part about this 1/6, so as Luis kind of spelled out in his paper, is that they find that social interactions per capita increase by 1/6 with this doubling of population. So you're having like more social interactions as cities get larger. I mean, that kind of makes sense, I think. But you're getting this sort of super linear increase in these social interactions. Yeah?
Do those effects change in cities that are more walkable versus cities that are not as walkable?
I don't know, but that's a good question. And to look at that, we have to look at the error here. Like, if a city is getting more of an increase in this GDP, are those the ones that are more walkable or something like that? So that would be a good question to look at those residuals and see if that maybe related.
Yeah, and I wonder if population density is maybe a better metric than overall population, because you could have a very, very large city who has lots of population, but people never see each other.
Right. So population density actually grows faster than the social network one. That goes by like 2/3. And it's not matching with GDP. So if it was about population density, we would expect New York to have way more GDP than Chicago. But it doesn't have way more according to population density. It has more by how these social networks are changing. Because you're exactly right. You could live in a building and have gigantic population density, but you don't interact, you don't know anybody.
Yeah, these interactions are ones with your actual social network or just random interactions?
So I'll show you, it might be a little bit of both.
Or something like
It might be a little bit of both. The thing that I'm going to show you later, they actually look at people's cell phones, like who are your friends in their cell phone network. Some of these could be actually incidental interactions. One thing I want to mention too, again, we also see the same thing with the spread of COVID. COVID also goes by 1.16. It doesn't go by 1.67. So it's not just about the density. It's about social, now the density contributes to the social network, but the social network is not growing as fast as the density is growing. Okay, so what did we do? I'm gonna just skip this. You guys have a lot of famous network people here like Danny Baskin and Duncan Watts. But we're gonna build a model and say, we're going to say that your mean social network degree increases with city size, and that your risk of depression is going to be inversely proportional to your social network degree. So you have a larger K, a higher social network degree, that's going to be inversely proportional to your risk of developing depression. Here, to get at what Shane was saying, this is how they validated that, that 1.16 exponent. They actually had cell phone data from people in Portugal and one other country. And they found here, like in Lisbon, your average social network size was 11, and Alicia, it was like 6. And they found here's the growth of your social network size and average versus population, and you get this super linear increase of like 1.12. Not exactly 1.16, but pretty close. So this is how they validated that. It's also saying, it's more in the paper, but this probability of having a social network size K follows this log skew normal distribution. And that's how we're building our model of depression, that we think your social network size is going to follow this log skew normal distribution. The mean of that distribution is going to increase with the city size that you're living in. And from that, we build this simulation. And so here's kind of what it looks like graphically. So in a large city, there's more people traversing the infrastructure networks. That's going to lead to a higher average social network size versus in a smaller city. And what that's going to mean is that fewer people are going to be at risk for depression versus in the smaller city. Okay? And if we run this simulation, here's what the results look like. So from this simulation, we're going to expect that as cities get larger, there's going to be less incidence of depression. And actually, the simulation finds that it goes about 0.56, basically matching the economies of scale of the road networks. Okay? So then we got a bunch of data. So we got data from 4 different sources. So the NSDUH and the BRFSS, these are data sources. One is from the CDC and one of them is from another federal agency that I can't remember. So we have these depression measures from these federal agencies, and we find, so those are the orange and the gray dots. We also find this sublinear scale, that as cities get larger, there's less depression. Then we also use Twitter data. So we found this paper, it's pretty incredible, that if you have about 80 tweets per Twitter user, you can convert that with a machine learning algorithm into a PHQ-9 depression inventory. So we did that. These Twitter data sets had about, well, this one here had about 800,000 people. And in that data set, we also find the sublinear scale, that as cities get larger, there's less incidence of depression. And it's kind of matching what Luis Betancourt finds for the road networks and for the increases in GDP. So this is kind of interesting. This kind of suggests that, well, one thing, depression is incredibly complicated, right? If we think about all the different variables that might affect the probability of somebody developing depression, like their age, their wealth, their social support, their family history, their genetic predisposition, their brain structure, adverse effects that they have. And we're kind of saying, look, we can kind of summarize some of this just with one number, like the size of the city that you're in. So that's, I'm not saying that explains all the variance, but it's interesting how good of a fit it is. So this integration of all these really, really complicated things, that we can summarize a lot of this complexity about depression with this simple scaling relationship. So that doesn't mean that individual differences don't matter, but this really, really incredibly complex phenotype of depression, we can sort of predict with this kind of really simple model. And I think that's something that I think is kind of really, really interesting.
You're putting this at the city level.
At the city
so
level.
You can predict levels of depression, average depression at the city level with city level factors. It's not like you're predicting individual depression.
No, but
so this is probability of depression at the city level.
Yes, but that's going to trickle down into the individuals, we think. It's also suggesting something kind of interesting, that we think that depression is a very individual phenomenon. This is suggesting, well, maybe it's a little bit of a collective phenomenon.
I just want to point out that I've just received word that we need to be finished by 6.
Okay.
Because of our assistant. So,
okay, so I'll just,
do with that information what you will, including telling people a couple of questions if that is what you need.
Okay. So I think this is just one thing we're thinking about. So where are depressive disorders? You know, I think a lot of people sort of are focusing here. But we're saying, well, depressive disorders might also be kind of up here, that you have to look at these different spatial scales. Oh my God.
It's nice to see your kids.
That's only half of them.
Oh, really?
That's an old picture. Right, so this kind of says, well, maybe we need to think about this at this higher spatial scale as well. Okay, I'm just going to skip that. Here I'm going to go to this last part. So now I'm going to show some brains. And this concept of fractalness. So I think many of you are going to be familiar with this idea of fractalness. So, you know, it's the idea of something being scale-free, that a snowflake has a particular shape. If you zoom in, you see the same shape. You zoom in some more, you see the same shape. Same thing's happening with the Sierpinski triangle, right? It's got this shape. If you zoom in, you see the same shape. You keep zooming in, you see the same shape. It's got a scale-free structure. It doesn't matter what spatial resolution you look at it, it's got the same shape. So fractals are a ubiquitous property in nature. So actually, one idea why we think that nature might be beneficial is that it has high fractalness. And we kind of think the brain likes fractals. It's a scale-free or scale-invariant scale-free signal. It's self-similar. Fractals are ubiquitous in nature. And as Benoit Mandelbrot, the pioneer of fractal geometry, is quoted saying they're everywhere. So this is looking at fractals in space, but you can also look at fractals in time. So you can also take a signal and basically see how fractal is that signal over time. Basically indicating, does it matter at like what window size you look at the signal, does its power spectrum have the same shape? If it does have the same shape, we say the signal is highly scale-free or fractal. If it doesn't have the same shape, we say it's not. So here's an example of two different signals that have different values and how scale-free they are. It's measured by this thing called the Hurst exponent. So this signal has an H of 0.72. This one has 0.94. The highest value that you can get here is 1. So a Hurst exponent of 1 means a perfectly scale-free signal. White noise has a Hurst exponent of 0.5. So what this means is basically, if we did the power spectrum density of this signal using only this time window, it would have some shape. If we extended that window out, it would have the same shape. Basically what that shape is that power is like directly proportional to frequency. So lower frequency things have higher power, higher frequency things have lower power. So it looks like this exponential kind of function. And when H is 1, that's when it's like more or less scale-free. So here's our hypothesis. So our hypothesis work that I did with Nathan Churchill when I was in Toronto, our hypothesis was that when the brain is in this high scale-free state, it's not exerting much effort. And as you start deviating, if you get this Hurst suppression, as Hurst values go down, that's going to be related to higher cognitive effort, or the brain sort of exerting more effort. Okay? So we looked at this with fMRI. So these are brain signals that very, very slow signals. They go from like 0.01 hertz to 0.2 hertz, or like one cycle every 100 seconds versus one cycle every 5 seconds. So it's a relatively slow signal. Here's some data that we looked at. So these are participants doing these 4 different cognitive tasks. The perceptual matching task was the hardest. So this hard visual perception task, it took participants on average about 1,500 milliseconds. They were only about 84% correct on those trials. The easiest task was this simple reaction time test. On average, it took participants about 500 seconds to do the task, and they were about 98% accurate. And what we find is this nice relationship, basically here, that you have higher Hurst values for this easy task. So blue here means that Hurst is suppressed more for the harder task versus the easier task. So you get higher Hurst values in these visual occipital areas, also some frontal areas, when the task is really easy versus when the task is hard. As the task gets harder, Hurst values go down. They move away from 1. Yeah.
And that's based off fMRI, not EEG.
This is based on fMRI.
but the temporal resolution of fMRI is.
Yeah, you're going to be so excited in 2 slides.
Okay, cool.
You're going to be really excited in 2 slides, okay? So this is one kind of cognitive effort, like difficulty in this task. When a task gets more difficult, Hurst values go down. The brain gets less fractal. We also find that Hurst goes down when you're, Hurst goes up or down, well, I'll put it this way. Hurst goes down when we are well practiced on a task versus just learning it. This is actually wrong, it goes up. So when you're well practiced on the task, Hurst values are higher, it's easier. When you're just learning the task, the Hurst values are lower when you're exerting maybe more cognitive effort. This is a little bit depressing. We also had aging data. Older adults who are matched on behavioral performance at 80% accuracy, when they're doing the task, Hurst values are lower than the younger adults doing the same task at the same accuracy level. Okay. Do our research translate to faster signals? Okay. If I'm saying this is a scale-free signature of cognitive effort, it shouldn't matter how fast the signal is. So here the signals are now 2 to 30 hertz, or 1 cycle every half second to 1 cycle every 33 milliseconds. These frequencies are about 10 to 100 times faster than fMRI. A lot of EEG researchers that do things with working memory load, they focus on alpha power, which is between 7.5 to 12.5 hertz. Okay? So we had participants do this working memory task, this change detection task, and I have a slide on it, where the working memory load changes from having a working memory load of 1 to 2 to a working memory load of 3 to a working memory load of 6. And what we find is basically Hurst goes down with increased working memory load in these EEG trials. So as the task gets a higher working memory load, Hurst values go down. When the task is really easy, Hurst values are higher when the working memory load is 1. And it's pretty global. It's, of these 20 electrodes, the effect is basically seen almost everywhere. It's a pretty global effect. If you look at alpha power, which is what like Ed O and Ed Vogel typically look at, they can distinguish like these trials, but they can't distinguish 6 from 3. But with this broadband signal, we can. And we think that's because alpha power is actually tracking how many things you have in working memory. People can't really have 6 things in working memory, so alpha power is not picking up. But they can certainly try harder, trying to remember 6 things versus trying to remember only 3 things. So the take-home message here is that even with this really, really fast signal, much, much faster than fMRI, we see the same thing. More cognitive effort, more Hurst suppression. Okay. Here's another thing that we found. So this is like psychopathology. Hurst, in kids, if they have higher general psychopathology and higher ADHD, they have lower Hurst values globally in the brain. And that's also related to their performance. So kids that have higher Hurst, they do better on this NBAC task in the scanner. They do better on this list sorting test out of scanner. If we look at their behavior performance 2 years after they've been scanned, we can predict their performance 2 years later based on their brain activation, their Hurst values at age 9. So again, suggesting that we think this is related. We think psychopathology would be an effortful state. That would be related to lower Hurst values. This is also related to their behavioral performance. Everybody with me so far? So I'm about to throw a wet blanket on some of my research. People don't usually do. So the question is, okay, does nature push the brain into higher Hurst states? So I'm saying interacting with nature is sort of an easier environment to process. Urban environments might be a more difficult environment to process. That would make Hurst values lower. So we had participants do this difficult dual NBAC task. So you have to track the location of this square on this 3x3 grid. You're also hearing numbers through headphones. You need to, this is a 2-back trial, you need to say, does the location of this square match the 1 2-back? Does the number that you're hearing in the headphones match the 1 2-back? So it's a very, very difficult task. And you need to be doing both of these tasks, both the position of the square and the digit. So you do this dual NVEC test, and then you either are shown a nature video, a 10-minute nature video, or a 10-minute video going through Europe and looking at some architecture in Europe. Okay? And then you do the dual NVEC test again. So we practice people on the dual NVEC test. It's really difficult. You do an anatomical scan, you do the dual NVEC test, you do pre-dual NVEC, then you see the video, either the nature or urban video, then you do the dual NVEC test again to see any changes in performance. So our hypothesis was that when you see the nature video, that's going to produce bigger improvements in dual NVEC, and maybe also watching the nature video, you're going to have higher burst values watching the nature video versus the urban video. Okay, I'm going to start with the good news. So not everybody improves on the dual NVEC test. So about half of the participants improve on the dual NVEC test, and this is A prime, and half of the participants don't. Okay? So this is just behavioral performance for the 60 subjects that did this study. 30 saw the nature video, 30 saw the urban video. Hearst predicts who's going to improve, independent of what video you watch. So if you watch, if your higher Hearst during the video predicts improvement. So if you're watching this video, if you're in sort of a more rested state, a higher Hearst state while watching the video, you improve more on this dual NVEC test. So that's pretty cool. And here's where those brain areas are. They're showing this higher Hearst during the video that's predicting improved performance on the dual NVEC test. The bad news is we didn't find strong evidence of Hearst differences during the movie watching between environments. And we also didn't see that the nature video produced more improvement on the dual NVEC test. So I think there's a number of reasons why. One reason is that we tried to equate the videos on preference. So it's kind of like a nice urban, nice nature, because we didn't want to just have this simple story that, well, just watching anything you like more might produce these benefits. But that actually might have mitigated some of the effect. But I think the cool part is that the cognitive state that you're in while watching that movie was predictive of changes in performance. So if you're sort of more in this rested state, or if the movie's putting you more in this rested state, you show more improvement in dual NVEC. So just to summarize here, the fragments of brain signals track cognitive effort. Maybe we can use this as sort of like a biomarker of cognitive effort, that if you're interacting with an environment that might be more taxing, maybe that's going to lower Hearst values. And maybe we can use that then to assess why certain environments are restorative or not. But to do that, we maybe want to employ like mobile brain imaging, so not have people in MRI scans, but maybe have functional near-infrared spectroscopy where you can just wear this little cap and go on a walk. We're also doing things now where we have an app called Retune, so restoring through urban nature experiences, where if you put in point A and point B, it doesn't route you on the shortest path between the 2 points, but it routes you on a walk that maximizes green space exposure, minimizes sound, and minimizes exposure to crime. So the one thing that we'd like to do here, well, we can give people a backward digit-scan task before and after the walk and see if we get changes. So just to end, because I'm out of time here, so the physical environment that surrounds us has significant impact on our behavior, and we may not be aware of it. I mean, that's a critical element here. Interactions with natural environments have a myriad amount of psychological benefits. Nature is not an amenity. We think it's a necessity. This doesn't mean that cities are bad. There's a lot of good elements of cities, but maybe we need to try to get more nature into cities to preserve all the good stuff and maybe get rid of some of the bad stuff at cities. All the biological mechanisms are unknown. We're working hard to understand it more, but we hope that all this research leads to trying to design and optimize physical environments to improve human well-being. So thank you all for your attention, and just thank you all.